Recently, I attended Warhammerfest. Although it was incredibly busy and I didn't get to do everything I wanted to, it was a great opportunity to hang out with some fellow hobbyists and even meet a few of you in person. But one event I did take part in was the Hobby Challenge. The basic premise of the challenge was to build a duel using one of the event exclusive miniatures and a giant pile of sprues. The tools we had access to were basic clippers, a line scraping tool, and some plastic glue, which for a frequent kitbasher like me meant I was building something on hard mode. After a few hours of building, this was a monstrosity that I was left with. Being heavily influenced by the creations of Vashtor, I built something that, while built almost exclusively from mechanical terrain, had an almost organic feel to it. This was made possible by one particular kit that was in plentiful supply during the challenge, the thermic plasma conduits. At the time of making this video, this particular kit wasn't in production by Games Workshop, and my guess is why there were so many at the event was probably because of the Partworks magazine, which is where I got this particular sprue from. As you can see, the torso is made of two pipe stations glued together, with one being flipped upside down. The snake-like tail is made from a series of pipe corners and angled sections, arranged to create a flowing form, with the end of the tail being the broken section with a plasma coil inserted. I used a few more of the coils on the back. I gave a couple that half-ejected look by propping them up with some offcuts of sprue. The only non-pipe parts used in this build were the braziers in the head. The braziers were from the time-worn Ruins kit, and the head came from a piece of scenery within the Age of Sigmar Extremis starter set. Incidentally, that kit also formed the basis of this particular conversion that was built at another hobby challenge at the Warhammer World Open Day. That particular hobby challenge was on a smaller scale and did have a much more varied selection of sprues though, which is why this particular conversion is much more involved. But the model isn't finished. It's not on a proper base and isn't painted. So let's finish it off. In order to give the original model a surface to face off against the Commissar on, I did attach it to a flat piece of ruin taken from a piece of Age of Sigmar scenery. But it needed a proper Warhammer base, which meant I had to carefully break away the pipes from the bottom section. Before I could attach the model to the new base, the contact points were trimmed back to the original plastic. If this wasn't done, the previously glued points wouldn't have adhered quite as easily. After the points had been shaved back to bare plastic, the model was glued to a 150mm oval base. While the snake-like tail took up the majority of the base, there were still plenty of areas that I could add a little extra detail to. Some topography was created by tearing up some large pieces of cork floor tile and stacking progressively smaller pieces on top to build up the height. Superglue was used to combine the cork chunks to both each other and the base. With the larger rocks in place, smaller lumps were torn up and these were glued around the larger ones to help remove some of that stepped appearance and also to break up some of the flatter areas between the rock clumps. But first, let's hear about the sponsors of this video, Aldrich Foundry. Are you tired of the same old character miniature for tabletop games? Do you want to stand out from the crowd with something truly unique? Well, look no further than Aldrich Foundry. With Aldrich Foundry, you can create fully customizable and highly detailed 3D printed miniatures for your tabletop games, be it Warhammer, Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, or any other tabletop miniatures game you might be looking to expand your collection for. Use Aldrich Foundry's intuitive and extensive designer to pick from a wide variety of races, classes, armor, weapons, and accessories to make your mini truly one of a kind. And with Aldrich Foundry's high-quality 3D printing process, your mini will come out looking just as you designed it. So, why settle for a generic, off-the-shelf miniature? Head on over to Aldrich Foundry today and unleash your creativity on the tabletop. Check out my link in the description and comments below and try out their designer right now. A big thank you to Aldrich Foundry for sponsoring this video. While one of the GW staff running the Hobby Challenge had given the model a quick coat of black primer, there were still a few points that had been missed and the base needed to be primed too. So, to continue with the existing primer, I hit everything with a black primer through my airbrush. This gave me the ideal starting surface and colour for applying a darker paint scheme to. The mechanical nature of the creature I had created lended itself nicely to something on the dark Mechanicus, and so red paint seemed like the ideal colour scheme. A slightly ironic take on the holy colours of Mars. To apply these, I settled on dry brushing. I first set up my palette with a few colours from the Tooth and Coats range, Sanguine Scarlet, Rust Orange, and Orange Flare. Using a very slightly damp rounded brush, I dipped my brush first into Sanguine Scarlet and then worked the paint through the bristles by wiping it across my palette. Once the paint had evenly covered the bristles, I then used a combination of quick strokes and stippling to coat the entire model. By keeping the brush ever so slightly damp, it allowed a smoother application of the paint and helped to build up the intensity of the red whilst keeping those recesses dark and shaded. This process was then continued by progressing to the brighter rust orange. By not completely cleaning my brush between the paints, it helped to blend the two colours together. A smaller area was then covered before using the same technique as last time, before then finally progressing onto the last colour of Orange Flare. This time I made sure to focus my attention more towards the upper parts of the model, especially across the shoulders. The dry brushing had provided a good starting point, but the colour was looking a little more washed out than I had intended. So, to help bring back that intensity, some Blood Angels red contrast paint was applied across all of the red areas. The translucent nature of the paint allowed the previous gradients and transitions to show through, whilst also strengthening the red coloration. As is always the case with contrast paints, make sure you apply the paint evenly across the surfaces. To give the paintwork a more weathered and damaged effect to better fit in with the Dark Mechanicus vibe I was aiming for, I began to apply some chipping. This was done by taking a piece of foam and tearing it into a rough shape. This was then dipped into rust orange and stippled onto my palette to remove the excess paint. The sponge was then lightly pressed onto the surface of the model, transferring the remaining paint in a series of irregular flecks. The result was the appearance of damaged and chipped paint, simultaneously moving the model towards that darker appearance whilst helping to add a layer of extra detail. With the red complete, a few of the smaller details could then start to be picked out. For this I used some more contrast paint, Black Legion. This paint is incredibly strong and is a great way of quickly and easily painting surfaces black. I used this to tackle all the various smaller pipes dotted across the model's surfaces. While I was originally building the miniature, I wanted to add a little more texture to some areas, specifically to create the appearance of built-up rust and corrosion, and this was done with a little astrogranite applied in several small patches. But to continue this rust effect, I decided to give those rough points of texture a small amount of the metallic paint, Surcoat Silver. In addition to these, I also picked out a few edges along the red areas. Again, this helped to tie into that damaged paintwork effect, revealing the bare metal beneath. The silver was simply a starting point though. The real rust effect would be created with some dirty down rust. I've used this in previous videos and it's an excellent way of quickly creating that oxidized effect. This was applied straight from the pot across the points that Surcoat Silver had been applied to. After applying an initial layer, I then took a brush loaded with water and used it to better spread the paint across the surfaces. As the dirty down dries, the rust effect begins to form, resulting in this incredibly realistic appearance. So far, there were a lot of reds and oranges on the model, and I needed a strong colour to contrast that. I settled on a bright, almost fluorescent green, but before I could do this, these areas need to be given a white base coat. Like with the red areas, more dry brushing was used to apply some white star to the flames, the half spheres on the head, and the tip of the rattlesnake-like tail. This method helped to block in the main areas whilst also creating some overspill onto the surrounding areas, giving the impression of light spilling out. Following this, a few chaotic runes were painted along the tail, partly to support that appearance of a demonically possessed machine, and partly to add a few small spots of contrasting colour. Following the runes, a little more dry brushing was applied around them, again helping to give them that glowing appearance. The white base coat would provide the excellent starting colour to apply more contrast paint onto, specifically striking Scorpion Green. The contrast paint, like before, smooths out the dry brushing whilst also giving it that bright, lurid green colour. Against the armour and orange rust, the green appeared especially bright and helped to break up the otherwise solid red colour. To finish off the black pipes, the edges were given a highlight of some cold corpse blue. Again, this cooler, greyish blue helped to add a little variation against the warmer reds, whilst also helping to lift up the details. With the model complete, I could begin painting the base. The first step was to pick out the rocks using a progressively lightening series of greys, specifically Dungeon Stone Grey, Wizard Grey, and Carcharadon Grey. Again, the same dry brushing technique used on the red was used here to quickly give the rocks that stony effect, whilst also retaining the dark shadows in the recesses. For the areas between the rocks, some texture paint was used to quickly fill out the empty space. I used some of AK Interactive's Dark Earth texture paste. This was layered across the gaps, which helped to add a little extra colour and texture. However, great care was taken not to overspill onto some of the larger rocks and the tail. Once the paste had been applied across the whole base, it was left to thoroughly dry overnight. Like with the rocks, a little dry brushing was applied to the texture paste. For this, I began with Dust Bowl, followed by Sandstone, and finally Temple Stone. All that was left to do now was to clean up the edges of the base with some Doom Death Black, before giving the whole model a coat of matte varnish, both to protect the paintwork and to reduce the slight glossiness created by the contrast paint. And with that, I was left with this. Here we have the completed Daemon-infused Dark Mechanicus snake, built entirely from scenery kits. As you can tell by this and my previous creation, the Hobby Challenge is a fantastic activity to take part in if you're a fan of kit bashing. Should you ever get a chance to give one a go, I would highly recommend doing so. For me, it kind of felt like kit bashing with the difficult settings pushed up a little higher. I didn't have access to my usual tools, so I had to make do with just clippers and a mold remover tool. My bits box was limited to only the kits at the event, and I couldn't just fall back on some green stuff. It was very much back to basics and really put my kit bashing skills to the test. So let me know what you think, and if you would like to see me recreate similar hard mode challenges in the future videos, I'd love to hear your ideas. Now before I go, let me just say a big thank you to everyone who took the time out at Warhammerfest to come say hello. It was great to talk to you. But if I missed you, well, hopefully I'll see you next time. Speaking of thanks, it's time to give a shout out to my Patreon supporters and channel members, the ever generous people who help keep these videos going. Especially my expert tier and above supporters, who are Jonathan Hart, Maciej Savitsky, Morgan, Sweatman, Tim, Daniel Dowling, Immaterial Creations, Joachim Falk, Johans, Jonathan Sandsteed, Mr. Grimm, Pale Juice, and the Googles. And my Sergeant level channel members, who are Fair Statement, Mr. Jared Hess 95, Nerdington Paints, Mark Taylor, Whale Tussler, and Philip Poyer. If you are interested in supporting me too, you can hit the join button below or find a link to my Patreon in the description. Supporters get a whole host of benefits, including ad-free access to my videos, sneak peeks, a private Discord channel, and exclusive merchandise. Speaking of merchandise, I also have a few t-shirts and mugs up for sale featuring designs drawn by me. You can check these out by following the links below or by going over to petethewargamer.com. So until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.